it's finally time to look at the data that I collected from all of those hundreds and hundreds of Doom benchmark runs across all of those 46 configurations. Now, in the previous video, I had mentioned that I had already recorded all this, but I went back and I was looking at some of what I had recorded, and I decided to do things a little bit differently. And so I'm redoing all of it, which fortunately, I mean, the part that I'm redoing is kind of the easy part. It's just me talking about it. The hard part was collecting all of the data. And a very little bit of new information has come to light in the last week or week and a half or whatever between when I recorded it and edited all of that, and when I'm recording this. And so I think that was definitely re-recording was the right choice. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive right into it. And I've kind of gotten this broken out by motherboard, which is equivalent in this particular case is equivalent to breaking things down by chipset. And then at the end, I'm going to look at some kind of cross chipset issues and some kind of look across things because, as we'll see a little bit later, trying to look at all of the data for a particular platform is just you can't see the trees for the forest, if that makes sense. So I'm going to start with the Aquarius Systems motherboard. This was the 386SX motherboard that I used in my 46 build off way back in September. Feels like forever ago. maybe it was October. It must have been October. No, I think it was September. Wow. Okay. Yes. So ages ago. So much has happened since then. I'm starting with this for a couple of reasons. One, because it's the slowest-ish. We'll see more on that later. Of all the systems, but also it's sort of the easiest to look at because it has fewer variables to consider. So all of the other platforms, there are all the different video cards to compare, but then there are also a bunch of CPUs and a bunch of cache configurations. On this, there's one CPU configuration, that clock doubled 486SXLC2. SXL. Anyway, whatever the alphabet soup is, and there is no L2 cache possible. So it makes it a much easier graph to look at. And so the shape of this graph is, we're going to see this a lot moving on. The general shape of things is not going to change a lot. It's primarily, with some few exceptions, going to be offset up or down depending on the system and the configuration that we're looking at. So there's a couple of important things to look at here. So one, across the bottom, I have things laid out by video card, and the left axis is the tics data that Doom outputs. So Doom, when you run a benchmark on it, it gives two pieces of information to you. So a demo is recorded, and that demo was a certain amount of sort of idealized time in the game. So that's the length of the demo, and it's going to tell you that, and I think that's what it calls. I don't remember what it calls it. It's the first number that it outputs, and so for demo 3, which I was using in all of these benchmarks, that number is 2134. And so the demo is nominally recorded at the maximum frame rate that Doom will do, which is 35 frames per second. And that seems like a really weird number to pick, but because of some things about how the PC timer works, it was a very, very convenient choice for them. And so everything is keyed on that. And when you're actually playing the game, all of the physics simulation and the AI and everything is tied to this this tick count that happens 35 times per second, and so that's also the frame rate cap. When you're actually playing when you're replaying a demo, it could go, you know, a million frames per second, but when you're actually playing the game, it caps it at 35 FPS. So there's a few numbers to look for when it outputs the other number that it outputs is real ticks, and this is how long it took to actually play the demo back. Now, 2134 is a beautiful number to see at this point, because that means that it averaged 35 frames a second, which is the max. It is possible to get lower numbers than that, but that means that your average overall. One thing that it doesn't output that most modern frame rate timing things will do is, okay, so here's the average FPS, but what was the worst? What frame took the longest, and like what percentage of the frames took, you know, were significantly slower than the average, and things like that, so you can detect when there are, you know, lots of stuttering or whatever for a variety of reasons. So then the other number, so there's a few numbers that I think are important in this. 2134 being the first one, the second one being 2988, and that is 25 frames per second. So right around 3000 real ticks is kind of like full screen with the detail settings that I use. Like that is a good, solid, playable frame rate. So I'll kind of keep an eye out for, you know, when things are at about this 3000 real ticks zone. The next one to look at is, you know, kind of moving down from first to worst is 4979. So around 5000 real ticks. That's 15 FPS, and that's kind of the zone where, you know what, in a pinch, you could shrink the screen down a little bit and maybe pick the lower detail mode and still have a decent experience. But I feel like 5,000 real ticks is kind of the hard cutoff. Like if at these settings, which, you know, I was playing at running the benchmarks, running the benchmarks at, you know, full screen, which isn't usually how you play because there's no HUD. Okay, full screen and full details. So, you know, if you can get 5,000 real ticks at those settings, you can tone down the settings and still have, I think, a decent experience. But below that, forget it. I mean, seriously, forget it. So there's another number that ends up being a little bit interesting, and that's 14,938, and that's 5 FPS. And there are a few cases where 5 FPS would have been a significant improvement over some of these scores. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this. So there's a handful of ISA cards here in the middle. So this particular platform, the other part of the refresher, only has 8 and 16-bit ISA slots. So it's only using the ISA cards, none of the VLB or PCI cards. So there's a handful of these kind of mid-range, you know, these. There's like the faster ISA cards, and they're all pretty close. Kind of these 4 cards here, the 2 Cirrus Logic 5420 series and the WDC cards, the WDC 90C31 cards. As the systems get faster, these kind of pull out farther ahead. So this area of the slope of this segment of line here becomes a little bit more dramatic on the faster systems, but the general shape is kind of the same. And there's a couple things here that are kind of interesting. So the slowest card on every single configuration is the Trident 8800, and it is slower than these 2 cards on the left, and these 2 cards on the far left are the Paradise VGA and the unidentifiable card. Like, none of the software that I ran to try to, you know, like SpeedSys or any of that could identify what the heck this card was. It just has AMI VGA BIOS on it. So that's how I have identified it. So these are both 8-bit ISA cards. And you can see the two 8-bit ISA cards are faster than the Trident 8800 16-bit ISA card. And that should not be possible. And yet it is 100% reproducible on every single configuration. And the faster of the two, so it is interesting on some of the systems, the faster of the two 8-bit cards, the Paradise card, is occasionally faster than the Trident 9000. So my first piece of advice about building a retro Doom machine is avoid the Trident ISA cards. Just say no. I'm gonna revisit this particular graph a couple times. It's gonna kind of come back to do some comparisons here. Oh, so then the other thing is, you'll notice that the fastest of these is somewhere around 7,600 real ticks. So just like, it's not. I did play on that system at the LAN party about a month ago, and I had to shrink down that window really small, really, really small, in order to get any kind of a decent frame rate. It was, life on that system was rough. It was playable for some definition of playable, but I would not want to do that again particularly. So the next system was the ECS 8521 motherboard. This again was a pure ISA motherboard. It used the ULi M1409. I actually think it's M1409A chipset. So this board I had some issues with. It supposedly supports up to 256K cache, but I could not get that to work at all with any processor, any set of jumpers that I could configure. Nothing. It just did not want to play along. There's information silkscreened on that motherboard with some of the jumper configurations, but there are a lot of undocumented jumpers, and there is no manual that I could find online. I will again plea, if you know anything about this motherboard, have a manual, anything, please send me some pictures of it, scan it and upload it, something, because otherwise it's quite a mystery. I also, on this board, I could not get the 66 megahertz CPU to work with any cache configured at all, and that is why there's only the 66 megahertz 0K cache line on this chart, because it would not play along. And then the other thing that some versions of this are going to repeat throughout this, and I think it's very interesting, and I do not have an explanation, is okay, so I'm going to find, so the line here with the kind of bluish boxes and the red diamonds, this is the 46SX25. This line here, that in some cases is quite substantially worse performance, like off the charts bad, is the clock doubled SX2 at 50 megahertz. I don't understand how that happens. They're both the same bus speed, so any weirdnesses about ISA timings being goofy or something like that should be the same on both of them, but the clock doubled CPU at 25 megahertz was spectacularly slower. I mean, to the point when I first started getting the numbers off this, I thought I did something wrong. What's going on here? And went back and rechecked everything to make sure that I hadn't botched something, and this was 100% reproducible. I think also in this configuration on this, when I would first power on the system, it wouldn't post at all, like no post codes, until I hit the reset button, and then it would boot up just fine. I mean, just fine, but also slow, slower than could be believed. And then, the 66 megahertz CPU, that's the line down here at the bottom, is appropriately much faster than any of the other speeds. So I don't get it. I do not get it at all. That boggled my mind. So on this system, with let's see, which line is that here? So the green triangles here is the 33 megahertz CPU with 128K cache, and with the 4 fastest ISA cards, that's kind of flirting with the playable range. I mean, that's, at this point here, so this is like probably 5400, maybe 5450 real ticks. So that's, I'm going to say probably 13 frames a second, kind of a ballpark. So maybe shrinking the window down quite a lot, and you could have, I mean, this is a much better experience than the previous system, for sure. But still not great. And I think that this is about as good as a non-clock doubled CPU is going to get on ISA. And even with the clock doubled CPU, you're down just a scratch above 4,000 real ticks, down here, and that's still not great. I mean, that's the like 20 frames per second kind of ballpark. I mean, shrinking the window down like maybe 2 notches from full screen, so you've got the HUD appears, and then shrink it down one more notch, and you would have I think a good time at that, but that's pushing it. In my opinion. Okay, so then this is where the sort of eye charts really where things get a little bit crazy. So this is the CH471A motherboard, which has the SIS chipset, and this was the one that had the most possible configurations. I could use, I think, all of the CPUs that I had that I could. This was the motherboard that has the broken jumpers on it, so I couldn't configure it for some of the CPUs. But every CPU that I could configure it for just worked. It also had the widest variety of cache settings. It had 0K, 32K, 64K, 128K, and 256K. And once I order the chips, 512K and 1 megabyte will also be possible on this motherboard. So there's a huge pile, a ridiculous amount of data here. And it's kind of hard to suss anything out of it, unfortunately. The things that show up for sure are that the on any particular platform, the VLB cards are predictably much faster, with one exception, are predictably much faster than any of the ISA cards. We don't have a repeat of that Trident situation. And what else is definitely... So this was the one board where I managed to get a couple runs with the Trident 9400. And on that, it is slower than all of the other VLB cards except the Diamond Viper with the YTech 9000. And the YTech 9000 in many cases performs, if you kind of follow, this group of points over here kind of is the same cluster as these. So it performs about like the faster ISA cards. And the way that card is wired up when you're not using its specific modes, when you're just using it for VGA, it's going through a 16-bit ISA chip. So it effectively is a 16-bit ISA card at that point, for if you're just doing straight VGA stuff. What else was interesting about this that is actually discernible? There are a couple of really big groups where things kind of cluster together. So all of the 46 SX25s, the performance is pretty dire. I mean, the fastest that it gets is right around 6,500 ticks. So forget about the 25 megahertz CPU. Like a DX25 or an SX25 just is not going to cut it in Doom on any of the platforms. And there's a huge jump on the VLB between the 25 megahertz CPU and the 33 megahertz CPU. I was expecting the jump on ISA to be pretty substantial because I wasn't reconfiguring the ISA clock divider, so I was effectively underclocking the ISA bus, and that doesn't have any effect on VLB. But it was still a huge jump. So again, all of the 33 megahertz CPUs are pretty closely clustered here. And then this sort of next group here are where you kind of see this weird orange guy here is the start of the Cyrix 50 megahertz CPUs. And we'll see in a later graph that the Cyrix CPUs are definitely slower than the non-Cyrix CPUs. So I'm gonna move on from this. We'll see some more of this data in a little bit less eye chart kind of form a little bit later on. Okay, so the other board that had a lot of data to look at was the 486A3GX4 motherboard with the ALI chipset. Now, ALI and ULi are the same company. I don't know if it was through an acquisition or if they just changed their name or whatever, but they're the same company. And so the M1409G is a eventual follow-on of the 1409A. Right? It's kind of the evolution. Again, get the same kind of results for the Trident card, where it's basically slower than any of the other VLB cards, but faster than the Viper. And the Viper performs about like the faster ISA cards. There was some weirdness on this where it really... What was the thing? So there's kind of a weird thing here with the Pentium overdrive CPUs. A bunch of the CPUs that were running at 25 megahertz frontside bus kind of had some anomalous behavior on some of the cards that I don't understand why the performance of them was off. So for example, I think that this particular piece of data here was actually misrecorded. There was something off, but there's this whole line here. So this with the kind of, I'm not sure what color you want to call that, these diamonds here. This is the Pentium overdrive running at 60 whatever megahertz. So that's the 25 megahertz frontside bus and the 2.5 multiplier with zero cache. And it's, why is it so slow? Because up here, so here's the SX25 with no cache, and then here's kind of a cluster of the SX25 with cache, and what else is mangled in there? Yes, these charts are hard to read. But it's just, okay, so the point is, for some reason, the Pentium was oddly slow. I mean, it was slower than other 46s running at lower clock speeds, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I guess the Cyrix chips were slower. So this bottom orange line is the Cyrix at 50 megahertz with no cache, and then this line here that's a little bit faster is the Cyrix at 50 megahertz with cache. So what the heck is going on there? All right. So again, a bunch of this data is going to come back in a much more easy to understand form a little bit later. This just sort of gives the general lay of the crazy land. Okay, so looking at, so this is picking a single video card. This is the Cirrus Logic 5428, which was one of the faster of the VLB cards. looking at it across a variety of CPUs as the amount of cache increases, kind of going in the sort of fixed increments that I could do on the, so this is the SIS motherboard. And so there's a big jump in general from no cache to cache, but then from there on, the jump really isn't that big. So I would say with an SIS motherboard, at least, get some cache, but don't worry about it too much other than that. Like if you're given a motherboard or whatever that has 32K of cache, don't worry about upgrading it to 256K. If you get a motherboard that has no cache on it, the difference in price between buying the cache on eBay or wherever for 256K versus 32K is pretty small. So just get the 256K. The other thing that this shows that I think is way more important is CPU is king. Like there is no amount of cache that you could put on this top line here is the SX25. There is no amount of cache that you could put on an SX25 that would make it catch up to the DX33 with no cache, right? So if you're going to spend money to upgrade one of these retro machines to a different retro machine, CPU first, for sure. And I would also say, you can notice on here that there's pretty significant gaps. Here's a huge gap on the 25 megahertz front side bus. And then on here, you go from the red diamonds to these squares. That's the SX250 to the SX266. I mean, that's a huge step from just, that small. It's a much larger step than the amount of change in megahertz would lead you to believe there would be. So the other thing that's interesting here is you can definitely see, so the red or whatever color that is, arrows. So this is the Cyrix CPU at 66 megahertz compared to the AMD CPU at 66 megahertz, and the AMD CPU is faster, for sure, right? Those and the Intel CPU should be the same because as far as I'm aware, it's the same piece of silicon. It just rolled out of a different factory. So I would, and we'll see a little bit more of this in a little bit. At least the Cyrix DX2V variant, I would avoid. I had a lot of problems with it, and the performance was not great. And then of course the Pentiums are by far the fastest. But honestly, unless you happen to stumble across one, I mean, this Pentium Overdrive CPU that I have, I found at an estate sale, and I got it very, very inexpensively. They are not inexpensive if you go looking for them on eBay. And if you're going to build a Pentium system, then just build a Pentium system, right? Because if you build a real Pentium system, you're going to have PCI, and PCI video cards are cheaper. They are way cheaper for the same performance level. Okay, so then looking at a similar kind of comparison on the ALI chipset motherboard, there were some kind of oddities on this. So one, this motherboard had problems with the Cyrix CPU. I forgot to mention that on the previous eye chart. I could not get the Cyrix CPU to work with 256K cache. I think it worked on just like 2 of the video cards and nothing else would post. Is that the one that wouldn't post? No, I take it back. That was the one where it would post, but at a certain point in the benchmark would crash at 256K cache, no matter what I did. And I could not. I also could not get that one working at 66 megahertz at all for the same reason. There was something that motherboard did not like that processor, and I don't know whose fault it was. So if you've got an ALI chipset, probably, you know, avoid the Cyrix CPUs because they don't seem to want to play nicely together. And even when they would work, I thought it was odd that the speed improvement of going from 0 cache to going to 128 cache was much more dramatic than it was on any of the other CPUs, except perhaps the Pentium at 60 megahertz. The Pentium at 60 megahertz really saw also a much larger jump, which I thought was interesting. And then at that point, the Pentium at 60 megahertz performed about like the 46 at 60 megahertz, or at 60 whatever megahertz. So I think so either in the previous video or the first time I recorded this video, I had said that the Doom benchmark is really a memory bandwidth benchmark and a video memory bandwidth benchmark. And so kind of what you're trying to optimize are those two things. And I believe that is what explains this somewhat anomalous data where the Pentium 63 is essentially the same performance as the 486-66. By all rights, the Pentium 63 should be much faster. It is a much faster processor. But with the 25 megahertz frontside bus, it has less memory bandwidth. So I think that's the explanation there. But again, you know, don't if you're building a Pentium system, build a Pentium system. I would fully expect that even a Pentium 66 with the 64-bit memory bus would just wreck all of these CPUs. It should be much faster because it's got twice as much memory bandwidth, right? By having twice as wide of a memory bus. But aside from that, yeah, CPU speed is king, and the Cyrix CPUs were kind of a bummer on this board. I did try to fiddle around with them quite a lot, and I could never get good results out of them on this system. Moving on to the PC Chips M919. This motherboard became the bane of my existence in this whole project. I complained about it a lot in the previous video. I promise, I do solemnly swear that I will not complain about it as much in this video, but I'll let the data, or rather the lack of data, speak for itself. So in this particular chart, there are a lot more video card entries because this platform is the only platform out of the whole lot that has PCI bus. So there are a bunch of PCI cards over here at the end. But there are a lot of gaps. So by the time I started running this system, the Trident VLB card had completely given up any pretense of working at all. So I never even tried. I think that I tried a couple times on this platform, but I never got anywhere with it. The Diamond Viper would never post fully on it. It would get stuck at 2A. It would boot far enough to get the little splash bar at the top that said Diamond Viper, we're so awesome, whatever it is that it says, and then that was it. It would just hang out there, and I could never get it to go any further. At some point in the benchmarking, when I got to some of the later CPUs on this platform, the Cirrus Logic VLB and even the Cirrus Logic ISA cards, you'll notice there's a big gap over here for the two fast Cirrus Logic ISA cards. They just wouldn't post. They would also get stuck at postcode 2A and proceed no further. No idea. And on the VLB cards, I have, you know, multiple. I have what, three of the 5428s, and so I tried all of them. I tried all of them in all those configurations and nothing. And it was weird because there was some cards that, you know, like here, there's a huge gap. There was only 2 cards that would work with the SX25, but multiple of those cards would work at 33, but one of them didn't work with the SX33. No explanation. No explanation. I did research online, and this board is notorious for just an awful non-compliant DLB implementation. There was someone had posted in a forum some correspondence that they had with someone who worked at ATI back in the day. They had the correspondence back in the day, where the guy from ATI had analyzed this motherboard and was just, oh yeah, they're doing things wrong. They are just violating the spec all over the place. They are just wrong. Stuff is not going to work on that board. Okay, neat. You know, I found even that their ISA implementation was kind of terrible, and there were some cards that didn't work some of the time, and that some of the performance was just... So, remember way back. I'm actually going to flip way back. Okay, so here we are, way back. So here is the Trident 8800, the slowest chip that I have, the slowest VGA chip that I have, and on the 50 megahertz super slow chip, it's got about, this is, you know, kind of the ballpark of like 14,000 real ticks. Okay, so keep this number in mind. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. That same card on the 25 megahertz CPU is off the top of the chart. It was slower than 17,000 real ticks. Like, when you're slower than a motherboard with a 16-bit memory bus, there is something woefully wrong with your ISA implementation. I'm just going to throw that out there. Like, you have done something wrong. And a lot of these scores are terrible on ISA. The VLB scores, you know, when it works, were okay. But the ISA implementation was just terrible. I was shocked. In PCI land, you know, the spread out of things is kind of what you expect. The SX25 was horrifically slower than everything, followed by the SX and DX33 had the same performance. There was some weird stuff going on with the SX250 that it did not like some of the cards. I don't know why there was such a dramatic effect with the 25 megahertz bus on some of the CPUs. So both the Pentium overdrive CPU and the SX25 on a couple of the cards took a really huge hit on the 25 megahertz bus. And I thought the way that chipset was implemented, and maybe this is the problem, that the way that chipset is implemented is that the PCI bus is fixed at 33 megahertz regardless of what the front side bus is. Some early Pentium chipsets, socket 4 and socket 5 Pentium chipsets, the CPU front side bus and the PCI bus were locked together. So if you were running a Pentium 90, you were only getting 30 megahertz PCI instead of 33 megahertz PCI, for example. But that doesn't explain this huge jump here that I don't get. So most of the cards performed about the same, except the ET4000W32P. This was supposed to be some fast card, some amazing thing, and yet they gain. It was the worst performer of the lot. I did not expect that. The ET6000 was, I think, always the best performer, but it was by few enough real ticks that if I were presenting this data as frames per second, those differences would get rounded off. They would be hundredths of a frame per second, kind of a thing. Like at the point where you don't care. But I mean, I guess that's good news in that if you are trying to put together a retro, at least 486 system to play Doom, it doesn't matter that much what PCI card, at least on this chipset with no cache. I don't know. There may be some other configuration where it matters, but this is not that configuration. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit larger comparison of all of the chipsets with a couple CPUs with a fixed ISA card. So this is all with the WDC 90C31A ISA card. And part of the reason why I thought this was interesting is, so here we have the lonely box. So from left to right, we have increasing amount of cache for each CPU chipset combination. So this lonely box here is that OPTi chipset with that clock doubled 46 CPU upgrade, and it performs better than a couple of the 25 megahertz CPU configurations. So it outperforms the SIS chipset at 25 megahertz, and it outperforms the other ALI chipset at 14 megahertz with no cache. When there's cache, it outperforms it. And I think superimposed there is the circle for the UMC chipset. So for the most part, that 50 megahertz CPU is faster than a 25 megahertz, but it is definitely slower than any of the 33 megahertz CPUs. So here we have no, I take it back. So this is the other. Oh, right. So this is the. I misspoke a little bit earlier. So this is the ALI chipset on the VLB motherboard. This is the earlier version of that same chipset, the ULi chipset, the one that I could only get to work with 0 and 128K of cache. This is a huge gap, right? That's the same CPU, right? So here's the same CPU, the SX25 on the SIS, the 1429, and the 1409. This gap's enormous. Why is that gap so huge? What were they doing right-ish? I don't know. Perhaps so. There may be jumpers on this motherboard for configuring the ISA speed. And so in these configurations where I'm basically underclocking the ISA bus, maybe it's still running fast here. I don't know. I changed the clock speed on that motherboard by swapping out the crystal. I don't know. I do not have an explanation for that. Okay, so then the other piece of data here that is interesting, and I feel like one of my graphs might have been missing. I may have accidentally left it out here. I'll edit it back in at the end. So 33 megahertz CPU, you see the same kind of thing. So this is the UMC chipset. Again, lonely because no cache. The blue arrow here is the 1429 chipset with no cache, and then with cache added, it has a pretty huge jump. So that particular chipset, for whatever reason, seems a lot more dependent on the amount of cache there, or rather on there being cache there. And this shows up pretty consistently throughout. And then this here again is the ISA board based on the earlier version of the chipset that is still just faster at the same. It was the exact same CPU in all those configurations, and for whatever reason, faster. So now the weird outlier that's here. So since the previous video, I got onto eBay and I found someone selling cache modules for that M919 motherboard, and I don't know if you can see very well on the back here that it actually says it's specifically for that motherboard. I did not go back and run a billion benchmarks on it. I ran a couple, and I may have missed mentioning one of them. So here we have, oh no, it's in the next graph. Okay, so here, this red line here with the X on it. So this is the UMC chipset with the SX266 CPU with 0 cache and with the 256K cache module. So it goes from worst to second place. The ALI chipset, the 1429, is still faster than it is. And then, way down here, so this was the configuration where I could only get the 1409 motherboard to run with 0 cache. I could not get it to run with any cache. So I guess it goes from worst to second to worst. But that's a pretty healthy improvement, and we're going to see some more of that on the next slide. So speaking of the next slide, this is a similar kind of comparison, this time with just a single CPU and on just the motherboards that had VLB. So again, the ALI is the worst with no cache of these three. The other two motherboards don't have VLB slots, so they're not included in this. They're the worst, but as soon as you put any cache on it, it is far and away the fastest of those three motherboards. And in this configuration, the UMC is fast. The SIS motherboard was faster when you get cache on it, but then as soon as you put cache on that UMC motherboard, it keeps a lead. It does pretty well. I had done another test with that motherboard with the Coast module installed, and I got some weird data. So I think there's some more exploring to be done with this motherboard. I've learned some other things about it, and I think I've figured out how I can get updated BIOS on it. So probably sometime, maybe in like February or something, sometime in 2023, I will do a video dedicated to that motherboard and see if I can figure some more things out and maybe get some other stuff to work. I don't know. We'll see. So, my final recommendations. CPU speed is king. Width of bus to the graphics card is probably on equal footing. I think that if you get a VLB motherboard with a 66 megahertz CPU and almost any VLB graphics card, you will have a good Doom playing experience. I would avoid some of the really, the cards like the Viper that were really targeted as high-end Windows accelerator, because engineering is trade-offs. So those cards favored Windows acceleration performance above all other things, and so their DOS performance kind of stinks. Given the choice between spending a little bit more money on faster CPU or cache, faster CPU for sure. Like I was starting to say, I think 66 is kind of the minimum, and you can definitely have a very good experience at 66 megahertz. I think, maybe if you can get it to work, a 50 megahertz, the non-clock doubled 50 megahertz CPU, that might be about the same performance as the 66 megahertz. Those tend to be very twitchy though, and it ends up being very difficult to get a stable system out of them. It might be worth a try. You might spend more time playing with jumpers and BIOS configuration than you spend playing Doom. But maybe that's what you find fun. You're trading a fair percentage of CPU clock speed in that case for potentially a significant boost in both memory bandwidth and bandwidth to the video card if you can get a video card that will play nicely at that bus speed. Most of them won't. Most cards, you will either have to configure some additional wait states in the BIOS, set some extra jumpers on the motherboard for if you have faster than a 33 megahertz bus speed, or set a jumper on the card. Or maybe all of the above, which, insert some extra wait states in things so that the VLB cards can keep up. And I think that is my advice. The other thing that I found at this, at the LAN party, I took all LCDs because I was not gonna lug around. I was not gonna lug around a bunch of CRTs, and I didn't have enough CRTs anyway. But one of the systems that I had set up while I was doing a bunch of the benchmarking of this was a nice Sony Trinitron multi-sync CRT monitor. Oh, it looked so good. So if you can, play it on a CRT. It looks better. It really does. I hate to admit it, but it really does look a lot better. If it's a CRT that you can get bright enough. I have at least one other CRT that is a bit old, and it would not be playable on that because I can't adjust that screen to be bright enough to be able to see anything. Okay. So I think that's enough. I'm going to put the whole spreadsheet of all the hundreds and hundreds of data points that I collected online as a Google sheet. There'll be a link to that in the description below. At least 2, maybe 3 of these motherboards are going to have dedicated follow-up videos for them in 2023. Possibly sooner rather than later. And I think that's enough Doom for me for now. If you enjoyed this video and its predecessor, I encourage you to click the like button. If you'd like to see some of those follow-on videos, I definitely encourage you to click the subscribe button. And until next time, try to remember the good stuff.